The Kalthine Ascendancy kept a book, and the book decided who lived. It was not called that. It was called the Table of Regard, and it was not a book at all anymore but a lattice of certified memory carried in the spine of every Ascendancy warship, sealed by the Reckoner's office, and consulted before a single shot was ever fired. Every hull the Ascendancy had ever seen was in it. Every hull had a number. The number said how much of the Ascendancy's attention that hull deserved, and attention, in the Kalthine way of thinking, was the only currency that mattered. Ordnance was attention, maneuver was attention, fear was attention with the lid off. A heavy cruiser of the Sarin Combine carried a regard of 11, a Tavish picket boat 4. An armed merchantman throwing slugs at 9/10 of light was rated at 2, because the Ascendancy had done the arithmetic on what such a slug could do to 60 centimeters of laminated ablative, and had found the answer amusing. A fleet tender was rated at nil. Not 1, not a fraction. Nil, which in the Reckoner's notation was a small open circle and which meant, this hull may be permitted to pass. This hull may be permitted to work. This hull will not be engaged, because to engage it would be to spend attention on nothing, and the Ascendancy did not spend. That was the law, and the law had never once been wrong in 600 years, across 400 systems, and the Ascendancy had grown very comfortable inside it. Which is roughly how the Empire came to lose a squadron to a ship it had already decided did not exist. The ship in question was 340 meters of scabbed plate and honest ugliness, and her name on the register was Fleet Auxiliary Hull 7, Tender Class, 2nd Series, formerly of a navy that had been dissolved 40 years before anybody aboard her had been born. Her builder's plate called her Cormorant. Nobody called her Cormorant. Somewhere in her second decade, a rating had noted that her main hull was a fat cylinder with a spout of a bow gantry, and a scorched patch on her flank where the reactor exhaust had blackened her forever, and had said she looked like a kettle left too long on the fire, and the name had stuck the way true names do. The Old Kettle. Or just the kettle if you were in a hurry, and aboard her you were usually in a hurry. She had no guns. She had never had guns. Where a warship carried magazines, the kettle carried ice. Where a warship carried missile racks, the kettle carried 4 capstans the size of grain silos, numbered 1 through 4, each one wound with braided line so fine it hurt the eye, and so strong that a single strand of it could hold a loaded shuttle against a hard burn. She carried 12 kilometers of that line, and a fabrication shop that could spin more. She carried a crane arm 80 meters long that the crew called the jib. She carried a flooded bay amidships with an open bottom, a moon pool of hard vacuum with a lip you could stand on, and that bay was called the well, and out of the well came everything the kettle was actually for. Welders, cutters, shoring jacks, patch plate, epoxy that set in 9 seconds and held for 9 years, hull staples, and men and women in scarred suits who went out and put broken things back together. She was slow. Loaded, she made 6/100ths of a gravity and complained about it. Empty, she made 2 gravities and a bit, because a tug's engines are sized for the load, not the hull, and nobody who wrote the Table of Regard had ever thought about what a tug's engines could do to a tug that had thrown all her cargo overboard. Nobody had thought about it because nobody had ever needed to. The table said nil, and the table had been right for 600 years. Ren Adisa was 19 years old, and on the morning the Ascendancy came to measure them, she was upside down in the throat of Capstan 3, with a fid in her teeth and both arms in the machinery to the shoulder. "Talk to me," the bosun said, from somewhere above her boots. Ren spat the fid into her hand. The turns riding, 3rd layers climbed the 2nd and it's pinched itself under the flange. How'd it get there? Because someone rendered it too fast on the last recovery and didn't watch the lay. "Someone," said Bosun Kefilwi Matsep in a voice like a door closing. "Say the someone's name." Ren shut her eyes. In the dark inside the drum, the wire smelled like hot metal and cold oil. "Me. I did it. I was on the brake and I let it come home too fast and it jumped the lay and now it's a riding turn. And if we take a load on it, it'll pinch. And if it pinches, it'll part. And if it parts. If it parts, Kef said, the bitter end comes back through the fair lead at 400 meters a second and cuts the deck in half. And anybody standing in the bite of it is meat. Good, said Kef, without any warmth at all, and Wren understood by now that it was the highest praise the woman had. So fix it, and don't be inside the drum when you do. It took Wren 40 minutes and a great deal of swearing, and by the end of it she had learned, in her hands and her hips and the ache behind her ribs, the thing the bosun had been trying to teach her for 8 months, that the line was not a thing you commanded. It was a thing you persuaded. You could only arrange the world so that the line's own nature carried it where you needed it to go, and then you got out of the way, and you never, ever stood inside the loop. Never stand in the bite. It was the first thing the bosun had said to her, and it would be the last thing Kef ever said to anybody, but neither of them knew that yet. Wren came out of the drum sweating, wiped her palms on her coveralls, and found the whole deck watch standing still and looking up through the gantry glass. And that was how she saw the Kalthine ship for the first time. It was beautiful, and she hated that it was beautiful. An Ascendancy survey corvette, 1,100 meters, and it did not look like a machine so much as an argument. Every line of it went somewhere. Its hull was a pale gold that the light of Hesperine turned to bronze along its belly, and it moved without any visible plume at all, and the effect from outside was of a thing sliding through the world without touching it. Beside it the kettle looked like what she was, a bucket with engines. Look at that, breathed Lynn at the helm board, not with envy exactly. Just look at it. I am looking, said Captain Adise Halloran, who had come onto the deck without anyone hearing her, which was a habit of hers. She was a small woman with gray at the temples and hands that had been broken and reset more than once. She had been a salvage master for 31 years and had never once commanded a vessel that could hurt anything. They're going to measure us. Measure us for what? Wren said. For nothing. Halloran folded her arms. That's the whole point, Adisa. Watch and learn how an empire tells you that you don't matter. It's an education. Costs nothing. The Kalthine sent an officer aboard, because the table of regard required a physical inspection for any hull not previously entered, and the table of regard was not a document that permitted shortcuts. His name was Vesiktal, and he held the rank of junior reckoner, the lowest rank an Ascendancy officer could hold and still be allowed to write in the certified memory. He was tall and narrow and gray-skinned, with the long fluted skull of a Kalthine of the northern lines, and he came through the kettle's airlock in a pressure suit of a cut so fine it made the human suits on the rack behind him look like sacks. He stopped in the receiving bay and let his eyes go over everything, and Wren, standing at attention beside the bosun with her hands still black to the elbow, watched him decide what they were. It took him about 4 seconds. "You are the master," he said to Halloran. His human speech was flawless and entirely without music. I am required to inspect and rate this hull." He produced a slate, thin as a leaf. "You will not be required to accompany me. In fact, it will proceed more efficiently if you do not." "I'll accompany you," said Halloran pleasantly. He had a way of tilting his head that was not curiosity but the opposite, a kind of filing motion, as if putting her into a drawer. "As you wish." They walked the ship for 6 hours. Wren was assigned to carry the reckoner's instrument case, which meant she heard all of it. She heard him ask what the 4 capstans were for, and heard Halloran say towing, and heard him write down towing without any further question at all. She heard him ask what the ice bunkers held, and heard Halloran say ice, and heard him ask why, and heard Halloran say because it's water, and radiation shielding, and reaction mass, and it's free, and we're cheap, and heard him write down ballast. She heard him find the well, that great cold open mouth in the belly of the ship, with the hard vacuum standing in it like black water and the tools racked around the lip in their hundreds, and heard him ask what work was done there, and heard Halloran say repairs, and heard him ask what kind, and heard Halloran say all kinds, and heard him not ask a single question after that. She heard him stand in the engine spaces and look at 4 torch bells sized for a hull 4 times the kettle's mass, and she saw him do the arithmetic, and she saw him get the right answer and put it in the wrong drawer. He wrote, propulsion grossly oversized for hull, indicative of a design intended to move loads rather than itself. Which was true, and which was a door, and he wrote it without any idea that it was one. At the end of the 6th hour he stood in the kettle's mess, which smelled of coffee and burned onions, and the hot plastic smell of a fabricator that had been running all night, and he made his entry. He read it aloud, because the Ascendancy considered it a courtesy, and because the courtesy cost nothing. Hull Fleet Auxiliary Tender Class of Pre-Ascendancy Human Manufacture extensively repaired. Armament, none. Armor, none. Screens, none. Offensive potential, none. Defensive potential, none. Crew, 41, of which 38 are technical ratings and 3 are officers. He paused. Regard, nil. He looked up. He seemed to expect something, perhaps protest. Halloran was pouring herself coffee. Nil, she said. That's a 0. It is an open circle, said Vesic. It signifies that you will not be engaged. It signifies that in any action within an Ascendancy operational zone, this hull is to be permitted to pass unmolested, to work unmolested, and to depart unmolested, and that no captain of the Ascendancy may expend a single round upon you without a finding of gross waste against his name. He put the slate away. It is, Master Halloran, the most benign entry in the table. Most species find it insulting. It is not intended as an insult. It is intended as a truth. Wren, who had spent 6 hours carrying his case and who was 19, said, It's not a truth, it's a guess. The mess went quiet. Vesic turned. He looked at her properly for the first time, at the coveralls, the burned sleeve, the black hands, the young face, and something almost like interest crossed the flat gray planes of him. It is not a guess, he said. It is a measurement. Do you know the difference? Yeah, said Wren. A measurement's a guess you've decided to stop checking. Kefmatsep made a small sound that might have been a cough. Vesiktal considered this for a long moment. Then he did something that Wren would think about for the rest of her life. He took out the slate again and he wrote it down. Not the regard, the sentence. He wrote down what a 19-year-old rating had said to him in a kitchen that smelled of onions, and he did not say why. You will find, he said, closing the slate, that the Ascendancy checks very thoroughly once, and that it is not necessary to check twice. Then he left, and the Kalthine corvette peeled away toward the deep, and the table of regard carried the kettle's open circle out into 400 systems, and in every Ascendancy warship in the Bight of Ladder, a line appeared in the certified memory that said, in effect, this hull is not worth your time. The Bight of Ladder was not a nation, it was a habit. 6,000 people lived in it, spread across a scatter of rocks and one great ring habitat called 9 Rings, which hung in a 200,000-kilometer orbit above the gas giant Hesperine, and made its living the way the poor have always made their living, by being useful in the places the rich did not want to go. 9 Rings was not a rich station and not a proud one. It was a wheel 4 kilometers across, spun for gravity, and it was moored. This is the part that matters. It was moored to the sky by a tether. The tether was the single largest object any human being had built in that system, and it had been built for a reason that was purely economical. Hesperine had rings, and the rings had ice, and the ice was worth money, and hauling the ice up out of the ring plane cost fuel, and fuel was the one thing the Bight did not have. So a very clever, very poor engineer named Osai had done the arithmetic in her kitchen in the 4th year of the settlement, and the answer she had gotten was, don't lift the ice. Let the ice lift itself. She had run a cable, 140 kilometers of it, braided from spun basalt fiber and boron thread, thicker than a man's chest at the middle and tapering to a wrist at each end from 9 rings down toward the planet. At the bottom of the cable she had hung a ballast, a slug of processed slag and ice and rock, 40,000 tons of it, a dead gray lump called the sinker. And then physics had done the rest, because a long cable in a gravity gradient does a strange and beautiful thing. The bottom end wants to fall faster than the top end. The whole assembly stiffens. It stands radial, pointing at the planet like a plumb line, and it stays that way forever, because that is the lowest energy shape it can find. The sinker hung below. 9 rings hung above. And a climbing car ran up and down the cable carrying ice, and the whole thing balanced, and it had balanced for 61 years. Wren had grown up 200 meters from the tether's upper anchor. She had been taken to see it, as all the station's children were, on the day she turned 6, taken to the great cold room at the hub where the cable came in through a bearing the size of a house and terminated in a socket of forged steel, and told, "This is what holds us up, and this is why you will never throw anything at it, and this is why we check it every single day." It was, in its way, a very human piece of engineering. It did no work. It made no power. It simply arranged the world so that the world's own nature carried the load, and then it got out of the way. The Kalthine had surveyed it, of course. Junior Reckoner Vesiktal had written it into the certified memory in his neat, flat hand, under the heading of vulnerabilities. He had written, "The habitat is dependent upon a single structural member. Severance of this member at any point above the ballast will result in the loss of gravity gradient stabilization and the eventual decay of the habitat's orbit into the ring plane. No ordnance is required. A cutting charge of the smallest class or a single pass with a cleaving beam at low power would suffice." And then he had written the sentence that made him, later, unable to sleep. "This offers an economical means of reduction should the settlement prove non-compliant." He had not meant it as a proposal. He had meant it as an observation. He was 22 years old in the Kalthine way, and he was proud of his thoroughness, and he had been taught since childhood that the highest virtue in the universe was to see clearly and to write down what one saw. The Reckoner's office read it. The office does not employ young men to have ideas. It employs them to have facts, and then the office decides what the facts are for. 11 weeks later, a squadron left the Kalthine forward base at Tureth, under the command of High Reckoner Ascendancy, with orders to bring the Bight of Ladder into compliance, and with a certified memory that contained, among 400,000 other entries, 1 line describing a tether, and 1 small open circle beside a hull named Cormorant. Neither entry was wrong. They were simply the same mistake, made twice. The winter of the Bight, which is what they called the 11 weeks when Hesperine's shadow swung wide and the ice mines ran double shifts, was the winter the Kettle changed. She did not change the way ships change in the stories. Nobody bolted a gun to her. Nothing was added to the Old Kettle at all, in the sense that a reckoner would have understood the word added. And if Vesiktal had come back aboard in the 11th week and walked her decks with his slate, he would have written down the same entry, and the entry would still have been true, and he would still have been wrong. What changed was smaller than that and much larger. It started, as most things aboard the Kettle started, with Captain Halloran sitting in the mess at 400 with a cold cup and a bad mood. "They rated us nil," she said. Coop Kupfer, chief engineer, a heavy man with a burn scar that took the whole left side of his jaw, did not look up from his eggs. "You're still on that." "I'm going to be on it for a while." "It's a compliment. They said they won't shoot us." "They said they won't need to." Halloran turned the cup around. "You know what that means, Yusuf. That means when they come, and they will come because they always come, we are the only ship in this system that will be allowed to move. Every armed hull in the Bight will be dust in the first 90 seconds, and will be sitting there, untouched." Because we're nothing. Coop put his fork down. So the question, Halloran said, is what a ship that is allowed to move can do if it happens to be the only one. She got up. She went aft. She spent the next 2 hours in the well with the deck lights off, floating in the cold, looking at 12 kilometers of line on 4 drums, and thinking about the difference between a weapon and a tool, which is a difference that exists mostly in the mind of the person holding it. And in the morning she called the crew together and said the sentence that Ren Adisa would repeat, decades later, to apprentices who had not been born. "We are not going to make this ship dangerous," Halloran said. "We're going to make this crew dangerous, and then we're going to hand them this ship." Here is what that meant in practice, because it meant something very specific and very unglamorous, and the glamour is the part that gets remembered, and the specifics are the part that worked. It meant that for 11 weeks the Old Kettle drilled. Not gunnery drills. She had nothing to shoot. She drilled the things she could actually do, and she drilled them until they stopped being things anybody thought about. She drilled damage control. Every watch, at a time nobody knew in advance, the klaxon would go and a compartment somewhere would be declared hold, and the lights would drop, and the air would start venting for real out of a test valve, and the section party had 4 minutes to get there in the dark with a shoring kit and patch a hole they had never seen before. In the first week they averaged 11 minutes. In the 9th week, Kef Motsep rigged a drill in the flooded coolant gallery, in the dark in a suit, with a false hole in a curved surface behind a pipe run, and the section party had it shored and staunched in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and Kef looked at the clock and said, "Slow," and made them do it again. She drilled line handling until Ren's palms were leather. There is an art to a capstan, and it is a very old art, and it goes back to wooden ships and wet rope and men who died of it. You do not simply reel a line in. A tow is a living thing. The load surges, the line stretches, the stretch stores energy the way a drawn bow does, and if you take that energy up hard you will part the line and the line will kill somebody. So instead you surge. You let the drum slip, controlled, against the friction of the turns, and you bleed the shock out a little at a time. And the whole trick, the thing that takes 10 years, is knowing exactly how much to let go and exactly when to hold. Kef taught it to Ren with a fid and a length of practice cord and a great deal of contempt. "Feel it." "I'm feeling it." "You're gripping it. Gripping isn't feeling. If you grip, you'll fight it, and if you fight it, you'll lose because it's 100,000 tons and you're a girl from a river boat." Kef put 2 fingers on the cord, barely touching. "Like this. You hold it the way you hold a bird. Now surge." Ren let it slip too much. The cord ran. Again. Too little. The cord snubbed hard and the practice weight bucked. Again. 400 times. 500. In the 6th week she stopped counting, and somewhere around then it moved out of her head and into her hands, and one day she surged a live line under a real load without deciding to, and Kef, watching, said nothing at all, which was how Ren knew she had done it right. She drilled being empty. This was Coop's idea, and it was the strangest of them. Twice a week the kettle would go out to a clear volume and dump her holds, every ton of ice, every crate, every spare, all of it left in a slow drift with a beacon on it. And then she would put her 4 absurd oversized bells against her own suddenly featherweight hull and burn. The first time she made 2.1 gravities and half the crew was sick. The second time, with 400 tons of interior fittings stripped out that nobody had touched in 30 years, she made 2.4. She could not sustain it. Her frames groaned like a whale. Her thrust plate flexed a hand's width. She was a tug, and she had never in her life been asked to move like that, and she hated it, and she did it anyway. And by the 9th week Lynn at the helm could stand the Old Kettle on her tail and put her 3,000 kilometers in a direction nobody expected, in 110 seconds, and then coast, dark and cold and dead-looking, with all 4 bells shut and her hull temperature down where the ring ice lived. And she drilled warping, which is the oldest skill of all, and which almost nobody in the modern galaxy remembered, and which was going to matter more than everything else combined. Warping is how you move a ship without engines. In the age of sail, when a vessel lay becalmed inside a harbor and had to get out, they did not wait. They rode an anchor out ahead of the ship as far as the cable would go and dropped it, and then the crew walked around the capstan and hauled, and the ship crept forward to the anchor silently, against wind and tide, moved by nothing but arms and patience. Then they picked the anchor up and did it again. It was called kedging, and it was slow, and it was used by desperate men to escape from places where a ship was not supposed to be able to go. In vacuum, there is nothing to anchor to. Unless there is. Hesperine had rings, and the rings were ice and rock and dust, and the biggest bodies in them were house-sized, mountain-sized, tumbling slow in the cold. And Coop Kupfer, who was 54 and had never been to war and never wanted to, stood at the plot with a cold cup and said, "That's an anchorage." Halloran looked at him. "We put a hull staple in a rock," Coop said. 50,000-ton rock, we winch. The rock's got the mass, so mostly we move, not it. We come up to the rock, we pull the staple, we throw the kedge at the next one, we winch again. 0 thrust, 0 plume, 0 thermal. We are a cold hole in the sky that happens to be moving at 40 meters a second. He shrugged his big shoulders. It's slow as death. But nothing in the Ascendancy inventory can see it, because nothing in the Ascendancy inventory has ever needed to look for a ship that isn't burning. Halloran was quiet for a while. "How do you throw the kedge?" Coop grinned, which on his scarred face was a frightening thing. "Same way they did it in 1790, Captain. You throw a light line first." So they built the kedge gun in the fabrication bay out of a mining charge, a length of pipe, and a spool of messenger line, and they fired it 400 times at rocks in the ring plain, and Ren Adisa, 3rd-class rating, was the one who was best at it, because Ren Adisa had grown up on a shallow draft river boat where her mother threw a heaving line to a bollard on a dock in a running current 4 times a day and never missed, and Ren had been throwing that line since she was 8. You throw the light line. The light line drags a heavier messenger. The messenger drags the hawser. The hawser takes the load. It is the oldest sequence in seamanship. Something small and quick goes first, and something enormous follows it, and by the time the enormous thing arrives it is already too late to argue. In the 7th week, the Kalthine male cutter Ninefold Patience lost her attitude control 1,100 kilometers above the ring plain, and everything the Kettle had been practicing stopped being practice. It was a stupid accident, which most accidents are. A reaction mass line ruptured, vented asymmetrically, and put a slow, ugly tumble into the cutter. End over end, 7 revolutions a minute, which does not sound like much until you understand that the cutter was 200 meters long, and her ends were therefore moving at nearly 80 meters a second. She had 42 Kalthine aboard. Her drive was saved. Her orbit intersected the ring plane in 9 hours and 11 minutes, and a tumbling hull entering that plane at 6 kilometers a second of differential would not be wrecked so much as erased. The Kalthine had 2 warships in the system. Both were 4 days away. Both had beautiful screens and beautiful guns and no towing gear at all, because a warship does not carry towing gear. A warship has tenders for that, and the Ascendancy's tenders were at Tureth, and Tureth was 11 days out. 9 rings got the distress call at 2:17, and the Kettle was underway at 2:40, and Captain Halloran took her out empty, all holds dumped, and put 2 gravities against the black for 9 straight minutes, and the Old Kettle came over the horizon of that gas giant like an angry kitchen appliance, and got there in 5 hours and 40 minutes, which is a transit that nothing that ugly had ever made before. And then the hard part. You cannot simply grab a tumbling ship. A 200-meter hull turning 7 times a minute is a flywheel with the energy of a small bomb, and if you put a line on the wrong part of it, the line wraps, and then it either parts or reels you in, and either way you are now part of the flywheel. Halloran hung the kettle 2 kilometers off and watched the cutter turn for 11 minutes without saying a word, and everybody let her, because that was the job. Then she said, "Bosun, what's she doing?" Kefmatsep had her hands on the rail and her eyes half closed. "She's not clean. She's processing, maybe 1 part in 12. She's got a slow axis and a fast axis, and she's hunting between them. Once every 11 seconds her nose comes almost still, just for a moment. There's a spot near her bow where the velocity through the frame goes near 0. Kef opened her eyes. "There's a still place in the middle of it. There always is." "Can you hit it?" "No," said Kef. "Adisa can." Ren's stomach fell out of her. "They rigged it in 40 minutes. Not a tow line. A tow line would have been suicide. What they rigged was a friction snub. A heavy line led not to a capstan but around 1 bollard and back around a second and out through the fair lead, so it could be paid out under tension against nothing but friction, bleeding energy off his heat, the way a climber belays a falling partner. At the end of it went a magnetic grapple with a swivel head, because if the grapple could turn freely the rap would not build. And they took the kettle into 400 meters of a tumbling hull, which is a thing no sane pilot does, and Lin held her there with tiny bursts, and Ren Adisa went out onto the gantry in a hard suit with the kedge gun in her hands, and lay down in the fair lead with her boots hooked under a rail. The cutter came around. Ren counted. 11 seconds. The great pale shape of it swung, and the bow came up, and for a moment, for less than a second, the nose of the ninefold patient stopped being a whirling club and became a fixed point in the sky, a still eye at the center of all that motion. She had thrown a heaving line to a bollard on a moving dock 4 times a day since she was 8. Ren fired. The messenger went out flat and fast and took the grapple with it, and the grapple hit the cutter's bow 11 meters from where Ren had aimed, and its magnet slammed home, and the swivel head began to turn. "Lines on, lines on." "Snub it," Halloran said, calm as an accountant. "Handsomely, Adisa. If you take it hard you'll cut her in half." Ren put her hands on the belay. The line came alive. It is one thing to feel a load in a drill. It is another to feel the raw living pull of 200 meters of ship trying to turn, coming up the line into your gloves like something furious and enormous, and to know that if you close your hands the line parts, and if you open them the line runs out and 42 people die. She surged. Not a decision. Her hands did it. The line ran hissing and the friction bollards glowed dull red and then bright, and the tension climbed and Ren let it climb and then eased and let it climb again, and the whole time she was not gripping. She was holding a bird, and out there in the dark, very slowly, the tumbling stopped being 7 revolutions a minute and became 6, and then 4. It took 41 minutes. She burned 900 meters of line to heat. She did not part it. When the ninefold patients finally lay still, dead, dark, spinning at less than 1/10 of a turn a minute, which a ship's own gyros can absorb, Ren Adisa was lying on her back in the fair lead with her arms shaking so badly she could not unhook her boots, and the kettle's crew had to come and carry her in. And then, because that was the job, and because nobody aboard had ever considered any other possibility, they put the Old Kettle alongside and past a tow and hauled a Kalthine mail ship out of a decaying orbit and up to a safe altitude, and put a repair party through her hull and stopped the reaction mass leak, and gave 42 Ascendancy nationals hot food in a mess that smelled of burned onions. The Kalthine warships arrived 4 days later. Their captain came aboard, made a statement of gratitude that had clearly been recited from a card, offered payment, was refused, looked deeply confused by the refusal, and left. And in the certified memory of the Ascendancy, under Fleet Auxiliary Hull 7, Tender Class, an amendment was appended. Hull rendered assistance to Ascendancy vessel ninefold patients. Assistance was competent, No armament observed. No offensive capability observed. Regard unchanged. Nil. Junior Reckoner Vesiktal, who was by then a full reckoner and posted as liaison to the Bight of Ladder, read that amendment on his slate in his quarters aboard 9 Rings, and felt something scrape at the back of his mind, and could not name it. He got up and walked to the observation gallery and looked down at the kettle in her berth, scabbed, ugly, patched, a bucket with engines, and at the little bright sparks of welders working on her hull, and at the great drums of her capstans turning slowly as some rating somewhere relayed a wire. He thought they stopped a tumbling ship with a rope. He thought nobody in the Ascendancy could have done that. And then he thought, because he was Kalthine, and because 600 years of being right is a very heavy thing to carry, but it does not matter because a rope is not a weapon. He wrote nothing. He went to bed. 11 days later, the squadron came out of the deep with its running lights dark, and High Reckoner Ascendancy opened his orders, and the orders said, "Bring them into compliance economically." They came in at 4:10 station time, and they did not hide, because there was no reason to hide. 4 hulls, 3 cruisers of the Vetch class, 1,100 meters each, pale gold, and 1 monitor called Fixed Star, which was 2.5 kilometers of armored patience, and which existed for exactly one purpose: to sit in a gravity well and be unkillable while everything around it stopped being anything at all. High Reckoner Ascendancy transmitted his terms in clear, on every band, in 4 languages, and then he waited the required interval, because the Ascendancy is not cruel. It is only certain. The terms were simple. The Bight of Ladder would enter the Ascendancy's compliance structure. It would surrender its ice rights, its registry, its courts, and its ships. It would receive, in exchange, protection, law, and a place in the certified memory. It had 4 hours to answer. The Bight of Ladder answered in 3, and the answer was no, and Ren Adisa, standing on the kettle's deck watching the vote come in on a public channel from a station council of 11 shopkeepers and an ice broker, felt the floor of her stomach fall away and something else, harder and stranger, take its place. The Bight had 11 armed ships. 11 is a generous word. They were converted haulers with mining lasers and 2 genuine patrol cutters, one of which was older than the kettle. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. The Ascendancy did not slaughter them, and that is the thing human historians would find hardest to explain afterward, when the whole business had become a legend, and the legend wanted villains. The Vetch-class cruisers carried a weapon called a stilling beam, which puts a 15 Hz standing current through a hull's power lattice, and turns every switch and relay, and conducting path in a ship into a dead short for about a second and a half. It does not kill anyone, it simply ends the ship. In 6 minutes the Bight's entire fleet was drifting, 11 dark hulls with their crews alive inside them, breathing bottled air, watching. Ascendancy noted the time in his log with real satisfaction. Not 1 round expended, not 1 death, a perfect reduction by the book, and the book was 600 years old. Then he turned his attention to the habitat. 9 Rings had no weapons and no screens and 4,100 people aboard, and the Ascendancy could not simply shoot it, because shooting a habitat full of civilians makes the next 100 systems fight instead of comply. The Reckoner's office had done that arithmetic long ago. There is a right way to end a settlement, and the right way is to make the settlement leave. So Ascendancy read the survey, and the survey said the habitat was dependent upon a single structural member, and that severance of that member would result in the eventual decay of its orbit into the ring plane. Eventual, that was the elegant part. It would take 61 days. 61 days is not a massacre. 61 days is an eviction notice written in orbital mechanics. It is enough time for 4,000 people to pack and beg and be taken aboard Ascendancy transports and be settled and be grateful, and every station in this arm of the sky would see the sum and do the arithmetic and comply. At 9:55, the cruiser 10th Certainty came within 900 kilometers of the upper anchor and put a cleaving beam through the tether at an altitude of 6 kilometers below the hub. It was so small a thing, a hair of light 3/4 of a second. Wren was in the mess when it happened, and she felt it through the deck plates of a ship that was moored to the station's spine. A long, terrible, descending groan, like a cathedral clearing its throat, as 140 kilometers of cable that had been in tension for 61 years discovered that it was not attached to anything anymore. The parted end whipped. It took out the number 4 ice gantry and threw it into space. Then the whole vast length of it, and the sinker at the bottom of it, 40,000 tons of slag and rock, began to fall away from the station toward the planet, slowly at first and then not slowly, dragging the wreckage of the socket behind it. And 9 rings, unmoored, began to do what an unmoored thing does. She had been held radial by the tether. Now she was free, and free things in orbit do not stay where you put them. The station's own spin, which had been trimmed for decades against the tether's tension, began to precess. Her orbit, which had been held 2 kilometers higher than her natural altitude by the pull of the ballast below, began to sag toward the truth. And the truth was that 9 rings without the sinker was in a slowly decaying ellipse whose lower end would, in 61 days, brush the top of Hesperine's ring plane at 6 kilometers a second. The station's alarms went off, all of them everywhere, and did not stop. And 40,000 tons of dead gray ballast fell away into the dark below, with 140 kilometers of the strongest cable ever spun by human hands trailing behind it like a dropped thread. High Reckoner Asenartal transmitted his second message at 1004. He was, by his own lights, being merciful, and there is no reason to doubt it. He offered transports. He offered relocation. He offered full compensation at the assessed value of every private holding aboard. He gave them 61 days, and he told them the mathematics so that they could check it themselves. And then he moved his squadron to a high station 11,000 kilometers out and settled in to wait. He was not watching the tender. There was nothing to watch. The tender was rated nil. His own certified memory had a small open circle beside it, and a note that said the hull had once assisted an Ascendancy vessel, competently, with a rope. The tender had, in fact, gone dark at 9:58, 3 minutes before the cleaving beam fired, and had slipped her moorings and dropped down and away from 9 rings on cold gas, with all 4 bells shut and her radiators folded and her hull temperature falling toward the temperature of the ring ice. And by 1004 she was gone from every Ascendancy plot in the system, and not one reckoner aboard 4 warships noticed, because the plots were not configured to notice. Because in 600 years, nothing that mattered had ever moved without burning. "Say it back to me," Halloran said. The kettle's mess was full. 41 people floating, packed to the bulkheads in the red battle lighting with the ship silent around them. No drive, no rotation, no heat, breath steaming. Everyone in soft suits with the hoods back. Coop Kupfer had the plot up, and the plot was not a tactical display. It was an orbital diagram and a stress table and a page of arithmetic, and he had been doing that arithmetic since 9:59, and he had, at 3:41 the next morning, gotten an answer. "Say it back," Halloran repeated. "Adisa, you first. What are we doing?" Wren swallowed. "We're going to catch the sinker, because it's still on the end of the cable. The beam cut the cable up high, 6 clicks under the hub. It didn't cut it down low. So there's 140 kilometers of the best structural fiber in this system, falling toward Hesperine with a 40,000-ton anchor on the end of it. And it is still," her voice cracked, and she made it work again, "it is still perfectly good rope." "Good," said Halloran. "Chief, why does that help us?" Coop tapped the plot. "Because the station isn't damaged. Every plate on 9 rings is sound. The station's problem is that it's in the wrong orbit and it doesn't have the delta V to get out of it. It needs about 90 meters a second at the right point in the ellipse to lift its low end clear of the ring plane forever. 90 meters a second on 800,000 tons. He looked around the room. In fuel, that is more mass than exists in this entire system. Nobody here can buy that. So we don't buy it, said Halloran. So we steal it, said Coop, from the planet. He drew it on the plot with his finger, and Wren watched the shape of it appear, and the hair stood up on her arms. A tether in a gravity well is not a rope, it is a lever. Two masses joined by a cable orbiting with the heavy one below and the light one above. The whole system orbits as one, at the speed appropriate to its center of mass. But the upper mass is going too fast for its altitude. It wants to fly away, and only the cable holds it. And the lower mass is going too slow for its altitude, and it wants to fall, and only the cable holds it. The cable transmits an argument between them, and the argument never ends. But cut it at the right moment at the bottom of the ellipse when everything is moving fastest, and the argument is settled instantly. The lower mass released drops, and the upper mass released is flung. It keeps every scrap of the excess velocity the cable had been denying it, and it goes up into a higher orbit for free, and the energy comes out of the falling mass below, and no fuel is burned at all. It is called a momentum exchange release, and human beings had been doing it since before they left their own moon, and it is not a trick. It is simply an arrangement. We reattach, Coop said. We get the tether back on the station. Not the whole 140 kilometers, we don't have time and the whip would tear the hub off. We get about 91 kilometers of it with the sinker on the bitter end. We put it on the station's aft anchor ring, which is still sound, because the beam cut the cable, not the ring. We let the system stiffen. It'll take about 2 orbits to stop swinging. Then we wait for perigee. He pointed at the low point of the ellipse, the place where in 61 days the station would be scraped out of the sky. And at perigee we cut. And the sinker goes down, Wren said. The sinker goes down, it's dead rock. It'll break up in the ring plane and nobody will ever miss it. Coop's finger traced upward. And 9 rings goes up. 94 meters a second, by my numbers, and my numbers are good. And it puts her perigee 1,100 kilometers clear of the rings forever. And it costs us nothing but a cable we were about to lose anyway. Silence in the mess. Then Lynn, at the back, said the thing everybody was thinking. Chief, how do we get 140 kilometers of falling cable back onto a station that's 4,000 kilometers away and moving in a different direction? Coop looked at Halloran. Halloran looked at the bosun. And Kef Motsep, floating with her arms folded and her face like a closed door, said, You throw a light line first. Here is what they did, and every part of it is unglamorous, and every part of it is the reason the story exists. They warped. For 11 hours the Old Kettle crossed 4,000 kilometers of the ring plane without burning a gram of fuel. The kedge gun fired, and the messenger flew, and the grapple bit into a tumbling mountain of dirty ice, and Capstan 2 took a strain and hauled, and the kettle crept toward the rock, and when she got there the grapple released and the gun fired again. 41 throws. Wren made 31 of them, lying in the fairlead in the cold with the ring ice grinding past below her like a river in flood, and the great pale wall of Hesperine filling half the sky, and no light anywhere but her helmet lamp which she kept off, because light is heat and heat is a plume. Once on the 19th throw, the rock they had chosen turned out to be 2 rocks lightly touching, and it came apart when the line took the load, and the kettle got a sudden slack and then a sudden shock in Capstan 2 through a riding turn. The exact fault Wren had made in the drum 8 months before, in a drill, with a bosun standing over her. And this time it was real and there was a load on it, and the line began to pinch. And Wren Adisa, who had been hanging by a strap eating a ration bar, was moving before she knew she was moving. She got to the drum. She saw the pinch. She saw the deck party gathering at the fairlead to look at it, and she saw exactly where the line would go if it parted, and she screamed one word into the common channel. Bite. They scattered, all of them without thinking, without asking, because 11 weeks of a woman with a face like a closed door had put that word into their spines. The line did not part. Ren got the brake on it and Kef got 2 hands into the drum and they walked the riding turn back off the flange by hand, in vacuum, with the load humming in it, and it took 19 minutes, and when it was done Kef looked at her across the drum and said on a private channel, "That's the job." Ren, shaking, said, "Was I right? Would it have gone through there?" "Straight through," Kef said. "Would have cut 4 of them in half." She was quiet a moment. "You saw the bite before you saw anything else. That's what a bosun is. Remember that you did that." Then she went back to work, and the old kettle warped on through the dark, cold and silent and invisible and utterly unregarded, toward a falling cable and 40,000 tons of dead rock, and 11,000 kilometers above her 4 Kalthine warships hung in perfect formation and looked at nothing at all. They caught the tether at 2140 on the second day, 16,000 kilometers below 9 rings and falling. It was the single most frightening thing Ren had ever seen. The cable was not hanging quietly. It had been cut under tension, and 140 kilometers of it had recoiled and begun to writhe, and it was now a slow-standing wave of unimaginable violence. A whip 140 kilometers long with a 40,000-ton weight on one end, folding and unfolding in the dark with a period of 9 minutes. "We can't grapple that," said Lin. "Skipper, anywhere on the upper 80 clicks and it will cut us in half." "So we don't grapple the upper 80 clicks," said Halloran. She took the kettle down. Down past the writhing top, down the long screaming length of it, and 3,000 kilometers below the cut end, the whip began to quiet, because the mass of the sinker damped it, and 10 kilometers above the sinker itself the cable was almost still, taut in the planet's gradient, a single black thread standing straight down into the clouds of Hesperine. The sinker hung on the end of it, 40,000 tons of slag and rock and old ice, shaped like nothing, a gray lump with 61 years of grime on it, falling toward a world that would eat it in 9 days. "There," said Halloran, "that's our anchor, that's the whole ship right there. Bosun, get me a bridle on it." They put 22 people into the well and out onto the surface of a falling mountain, in hard suits, with hull staples and welding gear and shoring jacks, and they built a bridle. 4 hardpoints driven into the sinker's flanks, cross-braced with spar, converging to a single forged ring, and every weld inspected twice by a chief engineer who kept saying again, until his own hand stopped shaking. They cut the cable at the 91-kilometer mark and let the ruined upper 50 go, and Ren watched it fall away into the clouds, whipping, and understood without being told that she was watching the death of the thing her whole childhood had been moored to. They dressed the new upper end, a long, patient, exquisite splice, because you cannot bolt a fitting onto a fiber cable and expect it to live. You have to weave the load into it, spread it across every strand, let it take the strain the way the cable's own nature wants to take it. Kef Motsep and 4 hands did the splice by hand, in vacuum, in 11 hours, with fids and marlin spikes and the same motions, and the same swearing that had gone into every splice made by anybody since the first person on a wet dock decided a rope should be longer than it was. And then, with 91 kilometers of cable and 40,000 tons of rock hanging off her stern, the old kettle put her 4 ridiculous oversized bells against the black and began, at 4/100ths of a gravity, to climb. It took 31 hours. 31 hours of a tug hauling a mountain up out of a gravity well at a rate you could have outrun on foot, with her frames groaning and her reactor at 96%, and Coop Kupfer sitting on a crate in the engine spaces with his hand flat on the housing like a man calming a horse. 31 hours in which Ren Adisa slept 9 minutes. 31 hours in which 4 Ascendancy warships, 11,000 kilometers up, saw the drive plume of a tender and logged it, and did nothing, because the tender was rated nil and tenders move things, and there was nothing left in this system worth moving. Wren asked, at hour 28, floating in the mess with a cup of something that was pretending to be coffee, "Why don't they stop us?" Halloran looked at her over the rim of her own cup. She looked 11 years older than she had on the day she'd said, "We're going to make this crew dangerous." "Because they've already decided what we are," she said. "That's what a table of regard is, Atissa. It isn't a measurement. It's a decision they made once and filed so they'd never have to look again." She drank. "They're not looking at us. They're looking at the note they wrote about us." They remoored 9 rings at 7:14 on the 5th day. The station's aft anchor ring was sound, exactly as Coop had said, and the station's own crews had spent 4 days clearing wreckage from it. And when the Kettle came up under the habitat with the sinker trailing 91 kilometers below her like an absurd and magnificent tail, 4,100 people crowded every port on the underside of 9 rings and watched. The Kettle fired a heaving line, a light line, a nothing, a thread up to the anchor ring. Wren Atissa fired it, because Wren Atissa was the best on the ship and everybody knew it now. The thread went home, hands took it. The thread drew a messenger, the messenger drew the hawser drew the splice. And at 7:14, the great forged ring on the end of 91 kilometers of cable slid home into the anchor socket of 9 rings, and the pins went in, and a station engineer, whose name history does not record, dogged the last dog and stood back, and the tether took a strain, and the whole enormous system, habitat, cable, ballast, 840,000 tons of it, began, very slowly, to stiffen and to swing. It swung for 2 orbits, 9 hours, a pendulum 100 kilometers long, and 9 rings rang like a struck bell twice a swing, and people were sick, and nobody left the ports. By 1650 it had settled, and 9 rings hung radial again, plumb to the planet, held by a thread it had been given back. That did not save it. Everybody aboard knew that. The station was still in its dying ellipse. All they had done was give the falling thing a lever. The lever had to be used. "Perigee in 19 hours, Coop said. 1 shot. And it has to be within about 4 seconds of the mark, or we don't get 94 meters a second. We get 60, and 60 isn't enough, and there won't be a second cable." Halloran nodded. "Then we'll be within 4 seconds. "There's a problem," said Coop. "There was always a problem. The release has to be clean. If we cut at the anchor ring, the whole 91 kilometers whips back up at the station at a kilometer a second and takes the underside off it. We have to release at the bottom, at the sinker." Halloran was very still. "Somebody has to be on the sinker." With a cutter, 91 kilometers below the station, at perigee, 4,000 kilometers above the ring plane, cutting on a 4-second window by hand, and then surviving being on a 40,000-ton rock that is at that instant released into a suborbital trajectory into a gas giant. He rubbed his face. "The Kettle can be waiting. She'll have about 90 seconds to make the pickup before the sinker is deeper than we can climb back out of, and she has to be empty to make that climb. Bone empty, every gram." Wren Atissa volunteered before the sentence was finished, and Kef Motsep put a hand flat on her chest and shoved her back against the bulkhead without any particular violence, the way you would move a chair. "No, bosun." "No," Kef didn't look at her, she looked at Halloran. "It's the bosun's job, it's a cut on a load, that's the whole trade, Captain, it's mine." Halloran looked at the two of them for a long moment. "It's a 4-second window," she said, "and the timing has to come off a clock that's synchronized to the station, and the station's clock is going to be swinging at the end of a 100-kilometer pendulum. It'll want 2 people, one to hold the count and one to cut." Kef closed her eyes briefly. "Then it's 2 of us," she said. The sinker, up close in the last hour, was the loneliest place in the universe. Wren stood on it, boots magged to a plate they had welded down themselves, and above her the cable went up out of sight. A black line ruled against the stars, and at the top of it, 490 kilometers away, too small to see, was every person she had ever loved. Below her was Hesperine, the whole world. It filled everything. It moved. Bands of ammonia cloud the color of old bone and old blood turned slowly under her boots, and there was a storm down there twice the size of the earth she had never been to, and it was coming up because they were falling, because that was the point. Beside her, Kef Motsep checked the cutter for the 9th time. "Bosun, are you frightened?" Kef considered it, honestly, because she was not a woman who said things she had not first considered. "Yes," she said, "I'd be a fool, are you?" "Yes." "Good, fright's just attention, spend it on the line." She turned the cutter over, checked the charge, and set it on the cable's dressing plate and armed it and put her thumb on the guard. "Adisa, listen to me now, because there won't be time later. When it goes, this rock drops and we go with it, and the kettle comes down for us, and she'll only have one pass. You will not stand in the bight of the recovery line. Do you understand me? Whatever happens, whatever it looks like. You do not stand in the bight." "I know." "Say it." "I will not stand in the bight." "Good girl," said Kef Motsep, and that was the last conversation they had that was not made of numbers. The count came down from Coop, relayed off a laser link, corrected for the pendulum, corrected again. Perigee minus 60 seconds. The whole system at its lowest, its fastest, everything moving as fast as it would ever move. Perigee minus 30. Wren held the count. She spoke it aloud, and her voice was steady, and she never understood why. Perigee minus 10, 9, 8. And on the plot on the kettle's deck, 11,000 kilometers up and closing fast, a Kalthine monitor named Fixed Star lit her drive and began to come down. High Reckoner Asenartal was not a stupid man, and this is the tragedy of him. He had watched the tender haul a mountain up out of the deep for 31 hours and had logged it as salvage. He had watched the tender reattach the parted cable and had logged it as structural repair, and he had permitted it, because permitting it cost him nothing. A repaired tether does not change the station's orbit, and his arithmetic was correct, and the station would still be in the rings in 56 days. But at 3:50 on the 6th day, a reckoner on the Fixed Star's plot, a very junior one, a liaison officer who had spent 11 months aboard a human station, and had once been told by a girl with black hands that a measurement is a guess you have decided to stop checking, looked at the numbers coming off the tether's swing and did not like them. Vesiktal ran the arithmetic himself, twice, and then he stood up in the middle of the Fixed Star's command deck and said, out loud in a voice that cracked, "They are not repairing it, they are going to release it." Nobody understood him. He tried again, he was shaking. "The tether at perigee. If they sever the cable at the lower end at perigee, the upper mass retains the tangential excess. The station is thrown, High Reckoner, it is thrown into a higher orbit. It costs them nothing, it is a lever. They are using the planet as a lever." "That is not possible," said the Fixed Star's sailing master, and he was not being arrogant. He was reciting. "The energy required to raise 800,000 tons comes from the ballast," Vesik shouted. "It comes from the rock. They are trading a rock they were going to lose anyway for the lives of 4,000 people, and they have been doing it in front of us for 6 days, and we did not look because the ship doing it is rated nil." And High Reckoner Asenartal, to his eternal credit, did not have him restrained. He looked at the plot. He looked at the ugly, scabbed, patched tender hanging 4,000 kilometers below the station, with a cable running down out of her into the dark. And he did the arithmetic, and he saw, in one single cold instant, that a hull he had been trained his entire life to ignore had spent 6 days quietly building a machine out of nothing but a rope and a rock and a planet, and that the machine was about to work, and that his squadron, 4 warships, 10,000 crew, the pride of the Ascendancy, had no weapon and no doctrine and no entry in the certified memory for any of it. Cut the cable, he said. High reckoner at that range. Take the fixed star down and cut the cable above the tender, said Asenartau, before they cut it below. The monitor turned. 2.5 kilometers of armor and certainty, and she put her enormous engines against the Black and Dove, straight down into the gravity well of Hesperine, at a velocity and an angle that her own sailing master would afterward describe in his testimony as committed, which is a Kalthine word that means no longer able to stop. She was very fast, and she was very sure, and she had never in 600 years had to think about what was underneath her. She had also never in 600 years operated inside the ring plane of a gas giant with an ice cloud in it. Because when the Old Kettle had gone dark and run for the deep 6 days before, she had done what tugs do when they need to be light. She had dumped her holds. 11,000 tons of mining ice, vented in a slow expanding shell, cold and dark and radar quiet, drifting exactly where a ship coming down fast from a high station would have to pass, not because anybody had planned it, but because that is where you dump ballast when you are running for the deep, and you are in a hurry, and you do not want it near your own line. It was not a trap. That, in the end, was the part the Ascendancy could never get past. It was not a trap. It was just where the humans had put their garbage. Ren's count reached 0. Kef Matsep cut the cable. And 40,000 tons of dead rock and 2 people standing on it dropped away from the sky toward the storms of Hesperine, and 800,000 tons of habitat, 4,100 souls, a schoolroom, an ice broker's office, a garden that had taken 30 years, was flung upward and outward at 94.1 meters per second, free and clear, and forever. 9 rings rose. And 40 seconds later, the Kalthine monitor fixed star, at 11 kilometers a second, entered a shell of drifting ice she could not see and had never once considered, and lost her forward radiator array, and lost 3 of her 6 drive bells, and lost, in the space of a heartbeat and a half, the ability to climb back out of the hole she had committed herself to. The pickup went wrong in the 11th second, which is about when things go wrong. The Old Kettle came down out of the dark with her bells screaming and her hull glowing at the leading edges from the thin upper haze of a world that was reaching for her, and she matched the sinker's fall, which is to say, she threw herself into the same grave and agreed to climb out later, and she put her well over the rock and dropped 2 recovery lines with grab nets on them, and Kef Matsep and Ren Adisa unmagged their boots and jumped. Ren caught the near line, Kef caught the far one. And the sinker, which had been dead gray rock for 61 years, chose that moment to remember that it had been cut loose from a cable under tension. A stub of the tether, 40 meters of it, the last of the splice, still fixed to the bridle, snapped upward as the load came off it, the way a bent branch snaps back, and it came up through the space between the 2 recovery lines and it fouled them, and it took the far line and threw a loop of it across the well's lip. A loop, the bite. And Kef Matsep, hanging on the far line with her hands full and her boots off the rock, saw the loop begin to close on the exact volume of space that Ren Adisa was about to swing through. Ren never saw it. She felt a hand, the flat, hard, unromantic shove of a bosun moving a chair, hit her in the chest plate and throw her sideways and up, into the well, into the arms of the deck party who were already reaching. And she heard, on the common channel, at a volume that blew the gain out on 40 helmets at once, one word. Bite. Then the fouled line came home. It did not part. That is the thing Ren could never make anyone understand afterward, the small stupid fact she kept coming back to at 3 in the morning for the rest of her life. The line held. The line did its job perfectly. It was a very good line, and it had been spliced by a very good bosun, and when the shock came into it, it took the shock, and it stayed whole, and it swept the length of the well's lip with the whole falling mass of a mountain behind it. And then the sinker fell away below them, and it took the fouled line with it, and it took Kefilwe Motsep with it, and her beacon went down and down into the ammonia clouds of Hesperine, a single small steady pulse getting slower with distance, and the Old Kettle was already at her structural limit, and already 600 meters below the deepest point her frames had ever been rated for, and Captain Adiz Halloran, with her whole crew listening, said, "Chief, give me everything, we're climbing." Nobody argued. Nobody could have argued. The Kettle climbed out of the well of a gas giant with her plates flexing, and her thrust plate glowing, and Ren Adisa strapped to a stanchion in the well with her hands over her face, and behind them and below them the beacon pulsed and grew fainter, and then, somewhere around the 4th minute, stopped. And 2,200 Kalthine aboard the monitor fixed star began to die, 1,100 kilometers away and 4 minutes behind them. The fixed star had lost half her drive to an ice cloud she had never seen, and she had committed to a dive she could no longer arrest. She would go through the densest band of Hesperine's rings in 19 hours, and her armor was very good, and her armor would not matter, because a ring plane at that closing speed is not an obstacle. It is a grinding wheel. Her sister cruisers could not reach her. They had no towing gear. It had never once occurred to any Kalthine designer that a warship might need to be pulled, because a warship that needed to be pulled had already lost, and a warship that had lost was not a problem the Ascendancy solved. It was a fact the Ascendancy filed. There was exactly one hull in that system, with 12 kilometers of hawser on 4 capstans and engines sized for a load. It was rated nil. Captain Halloran put it to them, because a thing like that should not be done by an order. She stood in the mess, in the red lighting, with her crew floating around her, and Ren Adisa was in the back with her helmet still on and her face invisible behind it, and Halloran said, "They cut the tether. They came down to cut it again while my bosun was on the end of it. There are 2,200 of them, and they will be in the rings in 19 hours, and we are the only ship in this system that can take them out. I'm not going to pretend it's simple. I'm going to ask, and then we're going to go, and I'd rather go with you than without you." Silence, 40 people breathing. And then from the back, muffled through a helmet nobody had asked her to take off, "They've got kids aboard." Everybody turned. "Cadets," said Ren Adisa, "Vesic told me once. Every Ascendancy hull carries a training draft, 16, 17 years old. There'll be 300 of them on a monitor." Her voice was not steady. It was not anything. It was flat and cold, and it came from somewhere she had not known she had. "Bosun would go." "Yes," said Halloran quietly, "she would." "Then let's go," said Ren. "And let's be quick, because we're already late and somebody has to be on 3. Somebody has to be on 3. Capstan 3. The bosun's station. The one you put your best hand on, because 3 ran through the heavy fair lead and 3 took the shock, and whoever was on 3 had the whole tow in their fingers." Nobody made a speech. Ren Adisa went aft and put on the harness and clipped in at 3, and the deck party formed up around her, and every one of them was older than she was, and not one of them said a word about it, and that is how a rating becomes a bosun's mate. Not by ceremony, but because somebody has to be on 3 and everybody looks at you. Getting a line onto an Ascendancy warship turned out to be the hardest thing the Old Kettle had ever done, and the reason was almost funny. There was nothing to tie to. Her hull was a single continuous laminate, sheer and smooth and perfect, fair to shed everything, and there was not one bollard, not one payday, not one cleat, not one ring, not one hardpoint anywhere on 2.5 kilometers of the finest armor in 400 systems, because in 600 years of Ascendancy shipbuilding, no one had ever needed to make one ship fast to another. The Kettle's grapples would not hold, the magnets slipped on the laminate, the hull staples bent. "We weld," said Coop Kupfer on the open channel to a Kalthine command deck. "We come across, we clean your laminate down to substrate, we lay a plate, we weld a ring to the plate, 4 times. Then we run the bridle. You wish to bring welding equipment aboard the fixed star, said High Reckoner Ascendancy. I wish to bring 9 people and 2 tons of gear onto your hull, and I need them out there for 6 hours, and I need your point defense off, and I need your crew to stay out of my way. Coop's voice was tired and enormously patient. High Reckoner, you have got 19 hours. This conversation is costing you 11 minutes of it. Then Ascendancy, who was 68 years old and had commanded warships for 40 of them, and had never once been in a position where the correct decision was to let a stranger cut into his hull, said, "Point defense is off, come aboard." The Kalthine watched them work, and what they saw broke something. They saw 9 humans in scarred, mismatched suits crawl over the skin of an Ascendancy monitor with grinders and plate and arc welders, and clean and lay and weld, and check, and re-weld and check again, and swear and laugh, and eat ration bars through helmet ports, and they saw a heavy fabricated ring go on where no ring had ever been, and then a second and a third and a fourth. Cross-braced into the fixed star's frames through her own armor, by people who had read her structural schematic 4 hours ago, and understood it better than her own damage control officer did. They saw a chief engineer named Kupfer go down into a Kalthine reactor space where a coolant main had ruptured, and put a patch on it, an epoxy patch, a stupid, cheap, sticky, humiliating patch, the kind of thing you put on a river barge, and stop a leak that had been slowly killing the monitor's power plant for 6 hours, while Ascendancy engineers stood around it and consulted a certified procedure that did not cover it. They saw damage control parties come aboard in the dark, without maps, and shore 3 bulkheads in 11 minutes. They saw a 19-year-old girl with red-rimmed eyes stand at a capstan for 6 hours without sitting down. And Reckoner Vesiktal, in a suit on the hull of his own flagship, holding the end of a human heaving line in both hands because there was nobody else free to take it, understood at last what he had been looking at for 11 months. The Ascendancy had built a table for weapons. And these people had not built a weapon. They had built a crew, and then they had handed it a ship, and no table in the universe had a column for that. The tow began at 1911, 8 hours before the ring plane. 900,000 tons of monitor, 12,000 tons of tug. The kettle could not stop the fixed star. Nothing could stop the fixed star. What the kettle could do, the only thing she could do, and the thing she had spent 40 years doing to barges and ore hulks and dead freighters, was apply a small force for a very long time in exactly the right direction, and let arithmetic do the rest. 3/100ths of a gravity for 8 hours. It is nothing you could feel. It is a nudge. But 3/100ths of a gravity for 8 hours is 840 meters a second, and 840 meters a second, applied at the right angle to a falling ship, is the difference between a hull that goes through the ring plane and a hull that skims over the top of it and out into the clean dark on the other side. Everything depended on the line not parting. And the line wanted to part because a tow is alive. The fixed star's remaining engines were unbalanced and she surged. The kettle's frames flexed and she surged. The cable, 12 kilometers of it, stretched and recoiled and stretched again, and every time it did, the whole living load of it came back up through the fairlead into capstan 3, into a break, into 2 hands. Wren surged it. For 8 hours. She did not eat. She did not sit. She let the line run when it wanted to run and held it when it wanted to hold, and she never once gripped it, because gripping is not feeling, and if you fight it you lose, because it is 900,000 tons and you are a girl from a river boat. At hour 4, the load came on hard and fast, some Kalthine helmsman, trying to help, doing exactly the wrong thing, and the hawser rose and sang and threw a great slow loop out across the kettle's afterdeck. A bight of live line the size of a house, and standing directly inside it at the rail, where he had come out to watch the humans work because he could not bear not to, was Reckoner Vesiktal. Wren saw the bight before she saw anything else. That is what a bosun is. She had learned exactly one word of Kalthine in 11 months, from a tall gray man who had once written down something she said in a kitchen that smelled of onions. And she had learned it because Kef Motsep had made her learn it, on the theory that you never know who you will have to shout at. She screamed it. Vesiktal moved. He did not know why. He simply moved, the way the deck party had moved on the 19th throw, the way people move when a voice comes into their spine, and he was clear of it by 1.5 meters when the loop came home and cracked like the end of the world across the deck plate where he had been standing. He lay on the plates with his heart's hammering, and he looked up, and there was a human girl at a capstan 200 meters away, already back on the brake, already surging, not looking at him at all. At 3:02, the fixed star's low point in the sky came and went, and she passed over the top of Hesperine's ring plane with 1,100 meters to spare, which is nothing, which is a hand's breadth, and which was enough, because it was always going to be enough, because Coop Kupfer's numbers were good. The Old Kettle towed her out for 19 more hours, up and up, at 3/100ths of a gravity, into a clean parking orbit where her sister cruisers could reach her. Then the humans cast off, and recovered their line and coiled it, because you always coil your line. And then they went home, because their bosun was dead, and there were 4,000 people on a station that had been thrown into a new sky, and somebody had to tell them how it had been done. High Reckoner Asenartal came aboard the Old Kettle 11 days later. He came without escort, which was not required of him, and he came in a plain suit, and he stood in a receiving bay that smelled of hot metal and cold oil, and he looked at the rack of scarred, sack-like human pressure suits, and at the black handprints on the bulkhead, and at the 4 great drums of capstans 1 through 4 turning slowly as some rating somewhere relayed a wire. Captain Halloran met him. She did not salute. She had never saluted anybody in her life. "You have a dead crew member," Asenartal said. "Bosun Kefilwi Motsep." "Because of me." Halloran said nothing. It was not a question, and she was not in the habit of lying to be kind. Asenartal stood in that bay for a long time. "In 600 years," he said at last, "the Ascendancy has never been pulled out of anything. We do not have a word for it. We had to construct one in the report. The office rejected 3 drafts. He looked at his hands. "Master Halloran, I came down that well to cut your cable. If I had been 3 minutes faster, 4,000 people would be dead and your station would be scattered through the rings. And then you came and got me." "Yes." "Why?" Halloran considered him. There were 100 fine answers, and she gave him none of them. "Because you were in the water," she said. The amendment to the table of regard was drafted by Reckoner Vesiktal, and it took him 9 weeks, and it was rejected twice by the Reckoner's office and accepted on the 3rd submission, and it is the only entry in 600 years of certified memory that is not a number. It reads, in the flat, exact, beautiful language of the Ascendancy. Fleet Auxiliary Hull 7, tender class of human manufacture, name cormorant called Kettle. Armament none. Armor none. Screens none. Offensive potential none. This hull carries 12 kilometers of line on 4 capstans, a crane, a repair bay, and a quantity of ice. Nothing aboard her has been added since first survey. She is, in every measurable particular, the vessel we rated at nil, and that rating was correct, and it remains correct, and it is worthless. Regard unmeasured. The office directs that no captain of the Ascendancy shall engage this hull, not because she will destroy you. She cannot. She has nothing to destroy you with. She is to be let alone because on the day your drive fails, and your armor does not matter, and the arithmetic of your orbit has already been done and has already come out against you. She is the only ship in the sky that will come down into the well after you, and she will decide, in that hour, whether you go home. Weigh what that is worth, then weigh what we have been measuring. Beneath it in the notation of the certified memory Where a regard number ought to be, there is a small mark that is not an open circle. It is a loop of line, drawn by hand, the way a human bosun draws it, a bight with a clear space beside it where a person can stand. The bight of ladder was not annexed. The compliance order was withdrawn on the finding that the settlement could not be economically reduced, which was true, and which was the most beautiful lie ever entered into an ascendancy record, and everybody involved knew it, and nobody said so. 9 rings still turns, 4,000 kilometers higher than it used to, in an orbit that will not decay in 10,000 years. There is a new tether now, the crews spun it themselves, and at the top of it, in the great cold room at the hub, there is a plate with a name on it, and the children of that station are still brought there on the day they turned 6 and told. This is what holds us up, and this is why you will never throw anything at it, and this is why we check it every single day. 11 years later, a girl of 19 with a fid in her teeth came out of the throat of Capstan 3 on the Old Kettle, sweating, and found the bosun waiting for her. The bosun was 30, and had a scar across her chest plate she had never had repaired, and a way of standing very still that made people nervous. "Talk to me," said Bosun Adisa. "The turn's riding," said the girl. "Third layers climbed the second. I rendered it too fast on the recovery, and I didn't watch the lay. And if it parts—" The girl told her, all of it, the way it had been told to Wren by a woman whose beacon had gone down into the clouds of Hesperine and never come up, and when she was finished, Wren Adisa took the fid out of her hand and turned it over and gave it back to her, handle first, the way you pass a tool to someone you have decided to trust. Out beyond the gantry glass, an Ascendancy cruiser was coming into the bight on a courtesy call, pale gold, beautiful, 1,100 meters of an argument that went somewhere, and it dipped its running lights as it passed the tender, because that is a thing Ascendancy captains do now, and no regulation anywhere requires it. The girl was watching the warship. They all watched the warship the first time. "Don't look at that," said Wren. "It can't do anything you need." "Bosun, it's a battle cruiser." "It's a hull," said Wren Adisa. "That's all any of them are. Empires spend their whole lives counting hulls and never once look at the hands." She turned the girl around by the shoulder gently and set her thumb on the standing part of the line and put her own 2 fingers beside it, barely touching, the way you hold a bird. "Feel it, not grip, feel." And she taught her the only thing the Empire had ever really needed to know, that a ship is nothing at all until you find out who is holding the line.